Above the gorge, where the River Teign cuts its way off the edge of Dartmoor, there is a shoulder of granite that has been sitting in the same place, doing nothing, for something like 300 million years. Rain has run off it. Ice has cracked it. Heather has come and gone across the moor behind it more times than any ledger could hold. And then, in the second decade of the 20th century, a man looked at that outcrop above Drewsteinton in Devon and decided it needed a castle on top of it. Not a folly, not a country house dressed up in medieval fancy dress. A castle with granite walls thick enough to stop a cannon, with battlements and a working portcullis, raised deliberately in an age of motorcars and telephones and electric light. It is one of the strangest buildings in England, and the strangeness is not the stone. The strangeness is the reason it was built. Because this castle was raised to prove that a family was old, to prove a bloodline, to make solid in Dartmoor granite a lineage that never actually existed. That is the thing to hold on to as we begin. A fortress built to defend a lie. Not a lie about money, and not a lie about a crime. A lie about ancestry, about who a man's forefathers were. The whole enormous structure, every quarried block of it, exists to answer a claim that was quietly false from the start. And the man who commissioned it either did not know or did not want to know. He wanted the castle more than he wanted the truth. And so the castle is what he got. His name was Julius Charles Drewe, and he was born in 1856, which places him squarely in the Victorian middle class. The son of a family that traded rather than inherited. There was no manor behind him. There was no coat of arms hanging in a great hall, because there was no great hall. What Julius Drewe had instead was a gift for retail, for the buying and selling of ordinary things at scale, and in the 1870s that gift took him first into the tea trade and then into a shop in Liverpool. He understood something that a great many older and better connected men did not, which was that the future of the British High Street belonged to the man who could sell tea and provisions cheaply, cleanly, and everywhere at once. In 1883, still in his 20s, Drewe went into partnership with a man named John Musker and founded the Home and Colonial Stores. It was a grocery chain, and it grew the way very few things in that century grew. Tea, butter, tinned provisions, the everyday food of an entire nation, sold under one name from one town to the next. By the early years of the new century, the Home and Colonial Stores counted its branches not in dozens, but in hundreds, spread the length and breadth of Britain. Roughly 500 of them selling to ordinary households who had never heard the name of the man whose idea it had been. That man had by then already stepped back. Julius Drewe retired from the active running of the business in 1889, while he was still in his early 30s, an age at which most men are only beginning to climb. He did not need to climb any further. He was, by any honest measure, already rich, and he had done it himself, from nothing, out of the buying and selling of groceries. Here is where the story turns from the ordinary shape of a self-made fortune into something far stranger. A rich man in that period was expected to become a gentleman, and a gentleman was expected to have a past. Not a shop in Liverpool, not a partner named Musker and a warehouse full of tinned butter. A past meant land, and it meant ancestors, and it meant a name that sounded as though it had been carved somewhere centuries before you were born to carry it. Julius Drewe had the money to buy the land. What he did not have was the ancestors, and so he set out to acquire those too. He commissioned a genealogist, a professional researcher of family trees, to look into the history of the Drewe family and see what could be found. What came back was a link, though a doubtful one, to a man named Drogo de Teigne. Drogo de Teigne was a Norman baron of the 12th century. one of the hard men who had come across with the conqueror's world and taken land in the West Country, and he had held ground on the River Teign in Devon. The village that still stands above that river carries the memory of him in its own name to this day. Drewsteinton, Drogo's Teignton, the settlement on the Teign that belonged to Drogo. The genealogist offered Julius Drewe a thread connecting the Victorian grocer to the medieval Norman baron, and Julius Drewe took hold of that thread and would not let go. And it does not appear to have troubled him greatly that the thread would not have borne any weight at all. He committed to it completely. He changed his name. Drewe became Drewe, with an added letter on the end, and he did it by his own reasoning, because the older spelling looked older, looked as though it had come down through more generations, looked less like a shopkeeper's signature and more like a thing inscribed over a gatehouse. It is a small change, a single silent letter, but it tells you everything about the ambition behind it. This was a man aging his own surname the way a craftsman ages leather, working it and darkening it until the new thing passes for something weathered by long use. One letter, and a grocer's name began to sound like a baron's. And then he went looking for the land, because a Norman ancestor requires a Norman seat. Around 1910, Julius Drewe bought roughly 450 acres at Drewsteinton, the very village that carried Drogo's name, on the very river the baron had held. It could not have been more deliberate. He was not buying a comfortable estate near London where a successful merchant might retire. He was buying the specific ground that his invented pedigree pointed to, so that the claimed bloodline and the physical earth would line up and confirm one another. Here is the river Drogo held. Here is the village that bears his name. And here, now, is his descendant, come home at last to build the seat that history had somehow forgotten to give him. That the descent was a fiction did not change the acres. The acres were real. The granite was real. Only the reason was invented. To raise the seat itself, Drewe went to the finest domestic architect of the age. He commissioned Sir Edwin Lutyens, a man whose country houses were already famous for their wit and their humanity, their warm proportions and their clever plays of light, and he asked this architect for a castle. Lutyens took the work, because it was a vast commission from a client who could pay for whatever he imagined, but he was not entirely at ease with what he had been asked to make. In a private letter, Lutyens confessed his own preference plainly, writing that he wished Drewe did not want a castle at all, but instead wanted, in his words, a delicious, lovable house with plenty of good, large rooms in it. There is the whole quiet argument of the project in one sentence. The architect wanted to build a home. The client wanted to build a claim. And the client was paying, so the claim is what would rise out of the ground. Think for a moment about what that granite outcrop above the Teign really was, on the day the two men stood on it and looked at what they meant to do. It was blank. It was an unwritten surface, 300 million years old and holding no human story whatsoever. A great flat ledger of stone waiting for someone to set the first line down on it. Most men who inherit an ancient seat inherit the entries already made, the marriages and the deaths and the additions built by grandfathers they never met. Julius Drewe had no such entries. He had a blank page of rock and a fortune made in tea and tin provisions, and he intended to write the whole ledger himself in a single lifetime in stone, and to date the earliest entry 12 centuries before he was born. It is an act of extraordinary confidence and extraordinary strangeness at once, and it is the reason people still climb up to see what he made. There would be granite quarried out of the moor within sight of the walls it became. There would be a portcullis that could actually be lowered, and battlements against a sky that no enemy would ever come out of. and rooms below with electric light and modern plumbing and power drawn from the river itself. There would be, in the end, a building that some would come to call the last castle built in England, though that title, like the pedigree beneath it, would turn out to carry its own quiet argument for anyone who looked at it too closely. All of that was still ahead. All of it was still budget and drawings and quarried blocks not yet cut. What existed, at the beginning, was one wealthy grocer, one uneasy architect, 450 acres of Devon, and a Norman baron who had almost certainly never heard of any of them. The two men chose their day for the beginning, with the same care Drewe had brought to everything else. They would lay the foundation stone not on some ordinary working morning, but on a date that meant something to the man paying for it, so that the castle and its master would share an anniversary from the first block onward, the way an old family shares its saints' days and its births. They chose his birthday. They chose the spring. And so the ledger of granite got its first true entry, cut and set and mortared into the shoulder of rock above the gorge on a cool Devon morning, near the beginning of a century that would test the whole enterprise far harder than either man could yet imagine. On the 4th of April 1911, his 55th birthday, Julius Drewe laid the foundation stone at Drewsteinton, and the only question left was how a grocer's fortune could raise a castle out of Dartmoor granite. On the 4th of April 1911, his 55th birthday, Julius Drewe laid the foundation stone at Drewsteinton, and the only question left was how a grocer's fortune could raise a castle out of Dartmoor granite. The answer began behind a shop counter. There was no inherited estate here, no rent rolls stretching back through the centuries, no coal seam or cotton mill quietly minting money while the family kept its hands clean. The fortune that would buy the granite came from tea and butter and tin provisions, sold by the pound to ordinary households across Britain. In 1883, Julius Drewe and his partner John Musker had founded the Home and Colonial Stores, a grocery chain built on the simple idea that a working family in Leeds or Bristol should be able to buy the same tea, cheap and reliable, as a family in London. It was a business without romance and without a coat of arms, and it worked on a scale that older money could barely imagine. The stores multiplied the way weeds multiply. By 1903, there were roughly 500 home and colonial shops trading across the country, a grid of grocers laid over the map of Britain, each one taking in coins from customers who had never heard the name Drewe and never needed to. This was the crucial thing about the money. It did not come from land, and it did not come from blood. It came from volume. It came from millions of small transactions, a few pence at a time, repeated in 500 doorways from morning until the shutters came down. Julius Drewe had stepped back from the daily running of the firm before he was 35, already rich, and in 1919 he sold his remaining shares in the company for about £1 million. £1 million, assembled sixpence by sixpence over the grocery counters of a nation. Think of what that sum meant in the years before the First World War. It was the kind of capital that could have bought an existing estate outright. An old house with an old name already attached. The whole apparatus of gentry acquired in a single afternoon with a lawyer and a cheque. That is what most self-made men did. Drewe did the opposite. He decided to spend it building something that did not exist yet, on a bare granite spur above the gorge of the River Teign, and to make it look as though it had stood there for 800 years. The numbers he set aside for that ambition were, on paper, almost modest. The initial budget was £50,000 for the castle itself, with a further £10,000 allowed for the gardens. £60,000 then, to conjure a medieval seat out of Dartmoor rock. It did not stay at 60,000. Building in granite on an exposed hilltop, to the standards Drewe wanted and the design his architect kept refining, was never going to hold to a first estimate, and it did not. One tourism source puts the eventual outlay above £60,000 and offers a rough modern equivalent of something like £40 million. That conversion is a loose one, a way of translating an old sum into a figure the present day can feel rather than an appraised valuation, and it should be held loosely. But even at its vaguest, it tells you the shape of the thing. This was grocery money poured like mortar into the walls, load after load of it, until the fortune itself had been rebuilt in stone. And the stone was the point. Drewe did not import marble from Italy or dress the place in fashionable brick he built out of the country he was claiming as his own. The granite came from local quarries, from Blackingstone and Merivale, from Pewtor and Widden Down, hauled up onto the spur and cut and set by hand. It was hard stone, unforgiving to work, the grey bones of Dartmoor itself. Lutyens used it everywhere, and unusually, he used it honestly. The granite you see on the outside of the walls is the same granite you see on the inside. There is no thin facing of good stone glued over cheap rubble, no veneer pretending to be more than it is. The wall is granite through and through, exterior face and interior face alike, so that standing in a corridor, you are standing inside solid rock. For a man building a house to prove a lineage, the material carried its own argument. The stonework stood as a boast, spoken in granite, and it spoke in the plainest and heaviest words available. Here is where the design has to be described carefully, because it is easy to get wrong and easy to mistake for something more modern than it was. Behind the medieval silhouette, Castle Drogo is a 20th century building, and it draws on 20th century strength. But it is not a steel-framed structure with a stone skin hung on the outside, which is how a great many grand buildings of the period were actually put up. Sir Edwin Lutyens chose the harder road. He made the granite do the work. The massive walls, backed and reinforced with concrete where they needed it, were built solid enough that they required no hidden steel skeleton to hold the place upright. The stone was not decoration wrapped around a frame. The stone was the frame. That decision was as much a statement as an engineering choice. A steel cage would have been quicker and lighter and cheaper, and nobody would ever have seen it. Lutyens and his client wanted the opposite. Weight you could feel, permanence you could touch, walls so thick and so real that they made a steel skeleton unnecessary. In an age learning to build tall and thin, Drewe was paying a fortune to build low and immovable. It made for a strange and wonderful contradiction of a house, and Lutyens leaned into the contradiction rather than hiding it. On the surface, this was pure medieval theatre. There was a portcullis, a real working one, a great iron grille that could be lowered across the entrance, as though a besieging army might appear over the moor at any moment. There were battlements along the roofline, the notched parapet of a fortress designed to be defended. Every visitor arriving at the gate passed under the machinery of a castle that was expecting a siege that would never come. And then, behind that fortified face, came the 20th century in full. Castle Drogo was fitted with the modern conveniences of its day, and chief among them was its own electricity. Drewe harnessed the River Teign running through the gorge below and installed hydroelectric generation so that the castle made its own power from the water at its feet. A medieval keep lit by turbines. A portcullis at the door and a hydro plant in the valley. The place was, quite deliberately, two things at once, a fantasy of the Norman past in its shape and its silhouette, and a thoroughly engineered modern country house, in its bones and its services. Lutyens gave his client the drawbridge romance he had paid for, and quietly wired the whole thing for the century it actually belonged to. You can read the whole enterprise in that split. A grocer's son had made a nation's small change into a private fortune, and rather than buying his way into the aristocracy, he had chosen to manufacture it, stone by quarried stone, on a hill in Devon. The granite came out of the ground within a few miles of the site, as though the land itself were producing the proof of belonging. The walls rose thick and solid and enormously expensive, backed by concrete, crowned with battlements, guarded by a portcullis, and powered by a river. Every load of stone that went up the hill was another payment on a claim that had not yet been questioned. The money kept flowing, out of the shares and into the site. Sixpences turned to granite. And for a few years before the world changed, it must have looked as though sheer expenditure could build a bloodline as easily as it built a wall. It could not, of course, and the building itself would take far longer, and end up far smaller than the man who commissioned it ever intended. The fortune was real, and the granite was real, but the years ahead would test both against forces that no budget and no quarry could answer. By 1930, 19 years after that first stone, the castle stood finished at barely a third of the size Lutyens drew in 1911, and the reasons why reached back to a battlefield in Flanders and to a lie buried in the family tree. By 1930, 19 years after that first stone, the castle stood finished at barely a third of the size Lutyens drew in 1911, and the reasons why reach back to a battlefield in Flanders and to a lie buried in the family tree. Start with the lie, because the whole enterprise rests on it. When Julius Charles Drewe set out to build at Drewe, he was not chasing a view or a whim of taste. He was chasing an ancestor. The genealogist he had commissioned had handed him a lineage that ran back to Drogo de Teigne, a 12th century Norman baron said to have held land along the river Teign, the very land whose name still survives in the village of Drewe itself. That was the thread the grocer pulled on. That was why he added an E to his surname to make Drewe look older. Why he bought roughly 450 acres above the Teign gorge. Why he asked for a castle rather than the comfortable, large house Lutyens would rather have given him. Every granite block of the place was laid to prove a bloodline. The name of the castle, Drogo, was the ancestor's name. The site was the ancestor's supposed country. The premise was the ancestor's supposed blood. And the ancestor was not his. The connection to Drogo de Teigne, so useful, so flattering, so exact in its fit to the land Drewe wanted, was later shown to be false. Julius Drewe was not descended from the medieval Norman baron. The pedigree that justified the name, the site, and the entire idea of the building was a doubtful piece of research dressed as fact, and when the dressing came off, there was nothing underneath. Notice that this is not a scandal in the tabloid sense. There was no affair, no fraud in the ledgers, no public disgrace dragged through a courtroom. There was only a man who had built a fortress in stone to anchor a family tree, and a family tree that turned out to have been pruned back, in the end, to a single fabricated branch. The castle proved the ancestor. The ancestor proved nothing. That is the irony at the center of the story, and it is quieter and colder than any scandal, because there is no villain in it, only a wish that was never true. If the lie is the irony, the loss is the wound, and it fell in the middle of everything. Julius Drewe had 3 sons, and his eldest, Adrian Drewe, was the heir, the young man who was meant to inherit the ancestral seat his father was raising, stone by stone above the Teign. The First World War had already reached the building site by then, Work on the castle halted between 1914 and roughly 1918 as the country turned to the trenches, and the great scheme of 1911 froze, half made in the Devon weather, while the men who might have finished it went to France. Adrian went with them. On the 12th of July 1917, in the early fighting of the Battle of Passchendaele, in the churned and flooded ground of Flanders, Adrian Drewe was killed. He was the heir to a house that was not yet finished, built to honour a lineage that was not real. And he died before either the house or the truth about the lineage had fully settled. Sit with how the two threads cross here, because the crossing is the whole of Pass 3. In the same years that the war stopped the masons and idled the cranes, the war also took the son the castle was being built for. The building and the family were wounded by the same event, at the same time, on the same distant ground. You cannot separate the empty scaffolding at Drewsteinton from the telegram that reached the family in 1917. They are the same catastrophe seen from two ends. The fortune had raised the walls. The war stopped the walls and killed the heir who was supposed to live inside them. Adrian's death is described across the accounts of the place as having profoundly changed his father. The drive that had commissioned Lutyens, that had bought the acres, that had wanted a castle and not merely a house, that had laid the foundation stone on his own 55th birthday in 1911, did not survive the loss undimmed. Julius Drewe's commitment to the project, his appetite for its scale, his belief in the ancestral vision, were all cut back by grief in the same years that the war, and then the post-war economic downturn, were cutting back the budget. The two forces, the private one and the public one, pushed in the same direction, and the direction was smaller. Plans were abandoned. Ambition contracted. What had been drawn in 1911 as a full castle, a west wing, and a great hall enclosing a proper courtyard was simply never built. The great hall was given up. The west wing was given up. The courtyard was never closed, so the building you can stand in today is not the building Lutyens designed. It is about 1/3 of it. The finished castle is a fragment of the original scheme, and the missing 2/3 are not a matter of style or revision. They are the physical shape of the war years, and the money and the grief pressed into stone, or rather pressed into the absence of stone, into rooms that were drawn and never raised. When people say Castle Drogo is a castle that was never completed to plan, this is what they mean. The heir died at Passchendaele, the fortune had already been strained, the post-war world was leaner and harder, and the father, who had wanted everything settled, at last for a third. A castle built to enlarge a family had been shrunk by the loss of that family's future. And then there is the roof, which is the third failure, and in some ways the most damning, because it needed no war and no grief to ruin it. It was simply wrong from the start. Lutyens, for all his genius, chose for the top of Castle Drogo a technique that was then new and largely untried. He laid asphalt waterproofing over reinforced concrete. He did it without insulation. He did it without ventilation. He did it without any real allowance for the way different materials move against one another, the way concrete and steel and granite each swell and shrink with heat and cold at their own rates, straining and parting along their shared edges as the seasons turn. The result was a lid that could not hold. Water came through it, not years later, not after decades of neglect, but essentially from the point of construction, while the masons were still on site, before the building was even finished. The rain read the new roof the way a geologist reads a fault line, finding every seam where the untested skin had failed to marry the stone beneath, and it followed those seams down into the fabric of the house. Think about what that means against everything that came before it. Here was a castle whose walls had been built of solid granite, precisely so that no lesser structure would be needed to hold them up. Walls meant to stand as the plain statement of permanence, of a bloodline that would last, of a name made to look old. And the water walked straight in, over the top of them. The most modern part of the design, the flat concrete and asphalt roof that was supposed to be cleverer than the medieval forms below it, was the part that failed. The old idea of the castle held. The new idea of the roof did not. A fortress built to keep out time and change and doubt could not keep out the Dartmoor rain, and it could not keep it out from the very beginning. Set the three failures side by side, because past three is really the story of three things going wrong at once. The premise failed when the Drogo de Teigne ancestry was shown to be false and the whole reason for the castle dissolved. The family failed when Adrian Drewe was killed on the 12th of July 1917, and the heir the castle was meant for was gone. The fabric failed when the roof let water in before the last stone was even set. A lie at the root, a death in the middle, a leak at the top. And through all of it, Julius Drewe kept building, more slowly, more sadly, at a third the size, toward a completion that finally came in 1930. He did move in. That is the last turn of the knife. After 19 years of laying stone above the Teign gorge, after the war and the loss and the shrinking of the plan, Julius Drewe took up residence in his finished castle around 1930. He had it at last, the ancestral seat, the granite hall, the portcullis, the battlements, the proof in stone of a lineage that was not his. And he had it for barely any time at all. He died in 1931, roughly a year after he moved in. The man who had spent 2 decades and a grocery fortune building a home to outlast his name lived in it only briefly. An old man in a new castle, walking rooms that were a fraction of what he had once drawn, under a roof that was already letting the weather through. The water was never mastered while his family held the house. The ingress that had begun during construction did not stop when construction ended. It went on, quietly, steadily, year after year, working into the plasterwork and the timber and the decoration, staining ceilings, swelling wood, loosening the fine interiors of a house that had cost so much and meant so much. What Lutyens had built into the roof as an experiment became, for the Drewes, a permanent condition. They lived with it. They put buckets under it. They watched it spread. And they never solved it. Not in Julius's brief year. Not in the decades of ownership that followed. The castle that was raised to prove that this family belonged here for the ages could not keep itself dry for a single season. That is the shape of the reversal, and it is worth naming plainly one more time, so that nothing in it is softened into melodrama it does not deserve. There is no wicked secret here, no crime, no ruin brought on by vice. There is a self-made man who invented an ancestor and believed in him, who lost the son that ancestor was supposed to justify, who built a third of a dream and topped it with a roof that failed him from the first rainfall. The lie was in the paperwork. The loss was in Flanders. The failure was in the concrete. Together, they turned the grandest private building project of its age into something closer to an elegy, a granite monument to a bloodline that never existed, finished small, entered late, and already weeping water when its maker walked through the door. Julius Drewe died in 1931, barely a year after he finally moved in, leaving his heirs a brand new castle that had been letting in the Dartmoor rain since before it was even finished. Julius Drewe died in 1931, barely a year after he finally moved in, leaving his heirs a brand new castle that had been letting in the Dartmoor rain since before it was even finished. It was a strange inheritance, a fortress of local granite, walls thick enough to shrug off a siege that would never come, and above those walls a roof that could not keep out a shower. The family had a house that looked like it would outlast the country, and a ceiling that stained a little browner with every wet season on the moor. The water never stopped. That is the plain truth of the decades that followed. Lutyens had waterproofed the flat concrete roofs with asphalt, a method largely untried at the scale he attempted, laid without insulation, without ventilation, without any real allowance for the way concrete, steel, and granite each swell and shrink at their own rate through heat and cold. So the surface cracked, and the cracks let in the weather, and the weather went looking for somewhere to settle. It found the plasterwork first, then the timber, then the decorated rooms Drewe had spent a fortune fitting out. Ceilings bloomed with damp. Joinery softened. Year by quiet year, the building was eating itself from the inside, and no repair the family attempted ever reached the root of it. By the middle of the century, the Drewes were living with a problem that money alone could not solve, because the fault was not neglect, but design. You cannot patch a roof that was wrong from its first day. Buckets and running repairs bought time, nothing more. And a granite house on the edge of Dartmoor, magnificent and cold and always slightly wet, is an expensive thing to keep in a century that had run out of both servants and grocery fortunes. So in 1974, the family let it go. Julius Drewe's grandson, Anthony Drewe, and his great-grandson, Dr. Christopher Drewe, gave Castle Drogo and its grounds to the National Trust. It was an unusual gift for its time. The trust dealt in medieval abbeys and Tudor halls and Georgian mansions in the deep past of England. Castle Drogo was not even 50 years old. When it passed into the Trust's care, it became the first building of the 20th century the National Trust had ever acquired. A fortress younger than some of the visitors who would come to see it, taken in alongside ruins that predated it by 700 years. The Trust inherited the leeks along with the granite. And for a while the story simply continued as before. The waterworking, the fabric slowly failing. By the early years of the 21st century, the situation had crossed from chronic to critical. The roof and the window failures had reached a point that threatened not just the comfort of the rooms, but the survival of what they held. The collections were at risk. The structure itself was at risk. A building conceived to stand for 1,000 years was in real danger of being lost inside its second century, defeated not by war or fire, but by rain that came in through the top and never left. What the National Trust did next was one of the largest and most difficult conservation projects it had ever taken on. It did not begin with the whole castle. It began with a test. Between 2006 and 2007, the Trust stripped and re-roofed the chapel as a trial, a single smaller roof rebuilt to prove the methods and the materials before anyone dared touch the vast expanse above the main house. The chapel was the rehearsal. It showed what could be done and what it would take. Then came the main event. From 2013 to 2021, across roughly 9 years, the great rescue of Castle Drogo was carried out in full. The conservation architects Inskip and Jenkins drew up the design, and the work was enormous. More than 1,100 square meters of roofing and waterproofing were stripped away and replaced. Every failed layer of Lutyens' asphalt lifted off and rebuilt to a specification that could actually cope with the movement of the structure and the weather of the moor. The granite was repointed joint by joint, the old mortar raked out and renewed across acres of stone. The window surrounds, where water had been finding its way in around the openings, were dismantled and rebuilt. This was not a patch. It was the correction at last of the mistake that had been sitting over the family's heads since before Julius Drewe ever moved in. For most of those years, the castle disappeared. To reach every surface, the Trust wrapped the building in a colossal cage of scaffolding and sheeting, a temporary shell that swallowed the battlements whole. Castle Drogo spent much of the previous decade wearing its rescue scaffolding like a plaster cast, a broken thing braced and splintered while it healed. Beneath the wrapping, the work went on in all weather. The Trust patiently bandaging a century of leaks 1 square metre at a time, closing the wounds that Lutyens' roof had opened in 1930 and never let close since. It is worth being exact about what it cost, because the numbers can look like a contradiction, and they are not. When the project was first scoped, around 2012, the plan total came to about £11 million. Part of that, some £2.5 million, was sought from the Heritage Lottery Fund, the public money that so often stands behind the saving of buildings like this one. That 11 million figure was the target the Trust set out to raise and spend at the beginning. By the time the work was actually finished, the final reported cost had risen to £15.5 million. The lower figure is the plan. The higher figure is the reality once 9 years of the most painstaking conservation had run their course. A project of this difficulty rarely ends where it began. And a castle this stubborn was never going to be cheap to cure. In 2021, the scaffolding came down and Castle Drogo stood revealed, fully restored, for the first time in living memory, not actively taking on water. It reopened to the public, and it is open still. A visitor who climbs up to it in 2026 sees very much what Julius Drewe wanted them to see, only now it is watertight. The castle sits on its granite outcrop high above the Teign gorge, on the edge of Dartmoor, near the village of Drewstainton, the very place whose name Drewe had seized on to anchor his invented pedigree. From below, it reads exactly as intended, a grey fortress growing straight out of the rock, austere and enormous and improbable. At the entrance there is the portcullis, a real working portcullis raised over the door of a house begun in the 20th century. There are the battlements along the roofline, the toothed silhouette of a stronghold. Inside, the granite continues, bare stone on the interior faces of the walls, just as on the outside, and the rooms are dressed as the family kept them, the original early 20th century furnishings preserved in place. It is a castle built by a grocer to look 1,000 years old, saved by a charity for the enjoyment of the public, and it wears both of those facts openly. And so we come back, at the end, to the claim in its name. Castle Drogo is very widely called the last castle built in England, a phrase repeated in guidebooks and headlines and on the road signs that point the way to it. But among the people who study buildings for a living, the label has never been settled. The argument is simple enough to state, is this really a castle at all, or is it a large and beautiful country house wearing a castle's costume? It has a portcullis, but the portcullis was never meant to hold off an army. It has battlements, but nothing was ever going to be fired from them. It had its own hydroelectric power drawn from the river below and every modern convenience of its day. A true castle is a machine for war. Drogo is a machine for grandeur, for the proving of a story. To some historians, that makes the word castle a piece of theatre, and the famous title a courtesy rather than a fact. The most quoted answer to that objection came from the architectural critic Christopher Hussey, who refused to apologise for the place. The ultimate justification of Drogo, he wrote, is that it does not pretend to be a castle. It is a castle, as a castle is built, of granite, on a mountain, in the 20th century. It is a neat defence, and a stubborn one. Hussey's point is that the honesty of the thing is in its stone. Drogo is not a stage set of plaster and paint dressed up as a stronghold. It is genuinely built the way a castle is built, out of solid, worked granite, set on high rock, only it happened to be raised in an age of telephones and motorcars rather than in the age of longbows, whether that is enough to earn the title, or whether the title was always half a marketing line for a fortune that needed a bloodline, is a debate that has never quite ended and probably never will. That is the fitting last word for a building whose whole existence began with a story that was not true. Julius Drewe wanted an ancestral seat worthy of a Norman baron who turned out never to have been his ancestor. He got a castle instead, an actual one, 60 tons of more granite at a time, and it cost him his fortune's ambition, and it did not spare his heir, and it leaked from the day it was made. Then he died, and strangers took it in, and strangers spent £15.5 million and 9 years drying it out so that anyone who cares to can walk up and see it. The pedigree was false. The castle is real. Whether or not it truly is the last castle built in England, a claim architectural historians still argue over, Castle Drogo stands restored on its granite mountain above the Teign, a fortress raised to prove a lie, and saved, in the end, by the strangers who inherited it.